I'll introduce myself first. I'm Susan Hillier, and I'm the Dean for Research at UniSA in the Academic Unit Allied Health and Human Performance. And I'd like to acknowledge that at least I and my colleagues are meeting with you today on the lands of the Kaurna people, and that we pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and we acknowledge their ongoing connection to country. So I am really excited to be introducing my two favourite sleep colleagues. Oh, don't tell Jill Dorian I said that, you two. So firstly, we have Professor Siobhan Banks and then Professor Kurt Lushington. I've known them for quite a while. They do fantastic work. They are great speakers and, more importantly, great colleagues. So I'm really delighted that they are here to present to you today about their research. And so without further ado, I'll introduce Siobhan first. So as I said, Professor Siobhan Banks, Professor of Psychology and Director of BBB, which we just had a little argument about. She says it's behaviour, brain and body. I'd like to say body comes first. Just taking an unfair advantage there of speaking first. Siobhan's work is fantastically applied. She's a really industry engaged researcher, and particularly looking at sleep as part of a whole suite of human performance and human factors. So she will talk you through her work. So over to you, Siobhan.
Thanks so much, Susan, for that nice introduction. Yes, BBB, behaviour, brain, body. So we're all about looking at behaviour and its relationships with the brain and the body as well. So I will just share my screen. Hopefully that's coming up okay. And then, really what I wanted to talk to everybody today about was a little bit about the work we do as a group in the BBB, but particularly about what my research is focused on, which is, as Susan said, quite applied and working with different industry groups. And I know we don't have a lot of time today, so please feel free to put questions in the chat and we'll try and hopefully get to them at the end. Or I'm very happy, as always, to talk to colleagues anytime, so please feel free to email me. So my work is really centred around what happens with the Earth's orbital mechanics in the terms of the light-dark cycle. So these really gate our circadian rhythms, and our circadian rhythms, our 24-hour kind of rhythms in our body, they in turn gate a lot of behaviours around our sleep, for example, which is obviously my area of focus, but also our eating behaviours, our cognitive performance, our mood. All of these fluctuate over the 24-hour cycle. So I always like to show this picture of the Earth from space, because it gives a really great idea that how interconnected our biology and our behaviour actually are. And this is really kind of a central theme in a way of the BBB, where our work, while we're focused on behaviour, we're really interested in understanding how our biology from our brain and our body both intersect with that. So our tagline really is around building resilient behaviours to enhance human function. And so we're quite interested in a whole range of different topics that fit really in around this idea of enhancing function. And I'll get into that a little bit more in a moment. We have two main laboratories as part of the BBB, one that's focused around sleep and circadian rhythms or chronobiology, and another that's more focused around cognitive aging and impairment neurosciences. And that one is more focused around kind of dementia and aging and how behaviours and what happens during the aging process, it impacts cognitive function and how we might help improve that over the lifespan. But today I'm going to focus on my work, which really sits in the sleep and chronobiology laboratory. And within that, really what we do is we look at questions within the laboratory. So we investigate some more basic kinds of questions. We use the laboratory to interrogate what happens during the sleep-wake cycle, the implications for those changing sleep-wake cycles on performance and mood, and also physiology, and then use that information to help develop solutions for industry. And so we really take quite an evidence-based approach to our work that we do with industry. And we also verify that information that we've developed, or those ideas that we've developed in the laboratory, out in the real world context. So it's constantly feeding into the questions we ask. What happens in the real world and in the industry context feeds into the questions we ask in the laboratory, and then back out to verify that information into the real world. And our work is probably in the laboratory focused around these three main areas. And I'd say across the BBB, this is the same as well, although we come at these topics from different perspectives. So as I said before, we're really quite focused around cognitive performance, how we can optimize performance, and that could be seen from a multitude of different lenses, as I said. We're interested in enhancing that ability. So when there is an impairment, so for example, in my work, that might come from shift workers having to work a 24-hour cycle, working through the night, their cognitive performance will be impacted by being awake through the night and perhaps by not getting good recovery sleep during the day. And so we think about different kinds of solutions to enhance ability in those particular kinds of cases. And then we're also really interested in health and safety kind of aspects of this as well. So how can we improve health for workers, not just their cognitive performance? And of course, all that ties into safety and error reduction and increased productivity as well. So as I said before, we have this sleep and chronobiology laboratory. And what we do is bring participants into this space, and we can simulate different kinds of activities within this quite large suite of rooms. Generally, what people, they come in for a reasonably extended period of time. I always smile at this because people sometimes are a little surprised in how long we sometimes keep people in the laboratory. Really, it's anywhere from a few hours in a day to weeks at a time. And participants live in the laboratory over that period of time. And what it enables us is to understand the longer term dynamics of these impacts like sleep and stress and day timing, so the timing within the day on their performance and on their physiology. So for example, we might simulate a different kind of shift schedule and then have participants live that schedule and not leave the lab for several weeks. And this enables us to understand what it's like as people start to transition onto a period of shift work. And we also get to see what happens with their sleep as it changes, physiology. We might examine how metabolism changes over that time, and what happens when we also change not only the sleep behaviours, but things like eating behaviours as well. And so this enables us to understand what's going on from a physiological perspective, but also a behavioural or cognitive performance perspective as well. And within this controlled environment, we're able to manage the lighting, the sound, how much, the temperature, and all of those sorts of things. So we can make it a very comfortable and pleasant environment, ideal for sleep, or an environment that's actually quite challenging to sleep in. What you can see here on the screen is some pictures of different things from the laboratory. So obviously we use a range of different techniques to monitor performance and cognition, but also looking at various different types of technologies, as well as different types of simulation. So there's driving simulation there. We also have a control room simulation up in the top corner where we do different kinds of tasks that simulate real world activities. In the lab, there's 4 bedroom suites, each with their own bathroom and ensuite. And we also have kitchen facilities and also a biological kind of testing suite within that environment as well. So the participants can be in that environment for several weeks at a time without having to leave. So as I said, we take this work out into the real world. We call this science for the workplace. And this is really about helping us understand where there are the challenges and the problems that industry are facing, so that you can feed back into the questions that we ask in the laboratory, but also to help make sure that what we're doing in the laboratory is relevant for the real world. And we've done a range of different work, from the CFMEU workplace impairment policy documents to going to mines, and you see myself and Jill and Stephanie as well there on a mine site in Papua New Guinea a few years ago. So we are engaged quite a lot with different kinds of industries, but the industry questions are often quite similar around how to reduce fatigue and stress and improve performance in these kinds of extreme environments. So I just thought I'd tell you about two projects. I know I've got no real time left, but one project is really that we've just finished in the last running after the last couple of years, was around looking at changing the timing of eating to improve metabolic function in shift workers. So really the idea of shifting when you eat rather than what you eat. We've had great success with this, with seeing that metabolism can be improved rather than deteriorate over time when we shift people to these unusual kind of nighttime work schedules. And so we're just analysing that data and about to publish. The two papers there are from pilot work that PhD students involved in the project did. And then I also have this other project that I'll just quickly mention. We looked at sleep in submarines and was really looking at the way that motion affected sleep, so that we can kind of see how different kinds of head to toe or side to side motion might impact sleep and then therefore performance over the subsequent days. And this kind of information can feed into the new ways that areas can be designed, bunks, sleeping, air quarters, and that kind of thing can be designed to improve performance. And with that, I might finish because I know I've run out of time, and I will stop sharing the screen. But I think I've probably run out of time. Susan, have I, for any questions?
Well, if there's a quick one, we can, I'll just open the chat room. Watching the bunk rocking, I vaguely remember from my vestibular training days about pitch and yaw and roll.
Yes.
And I think is that pitch that people don't like? Pitch makes you chuck up a lot more.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we really discovered that it, perhaps unsurprisingly to anybody that's been in those kinds of environments with a lot of motion, that trying to sleep head to toe was a lot worse, so that kind of motion was a lot worse for sleep than the typical kind of rocking side to side. And I think you see that when we rock babies to sleep, we naturally kind of do a side to side kind of rock rather than obviously head to toe. So there's some interesting pieces there that we can learn from.
Great, good. Okay, well, that's fantastic. Thanks, Siobhan. And now I'll ask Kurt to come on screen. So Professor Kurt Lushington, he's also a professor in psychology. You're like twins, you two. And is particularly interested in research that's both applied and theoretical in sleep, and also investigates in both children and adults. So therefore, Kurt quite obviously then works at Women's and Children's Hospital as well as here at UniSA, and is also in BBB. So, Kurt, over to you for sharing screens.
Thank you very much, everybody. I'll just move you over to one side so I can see everyone. The title of my talk is Children, Sleep Disorder Breathing and Cardiovascular Health. And this is another example of a project coming out of the BBB. Just before I start, let me introduce my colleagues. On my left is Dr. Anna Kontos, and on my right is Professor Declan Kennedy. Both of my colleagues are from the WCH and affiliated with the Robinson Institute and Adelaide University, and I'm in the middle from the University of South Australia, and as I mentioned before, from the BBB. Much of the work that I'll be presenting here has come out of Anna's PhD and postdoctoral work. Why are we interested in sleep disorder breathing? Well, let me just give a very quick snapshot of this disorder. Essentially, when we sleep, the patency of the upper airway is reduced, which can lead to a partial or full collapse. as a consequence, you get hypoxia, which then leads to an arousal and a fragmentation of sleep. And in children, this can be exacerbated because of anatomical reasons, such as a narrow airway and large tonsils. Much of the work that we've been doing actually has been interested in the effects of sleep disorder breathing on cognitive function. And that's part of a larger story about the role that sleep plays in brain development. However, recently we've become interested in the impact of SDB on the cardiovascular system. In adults, there's compelling evidence that sleep disorder breathing is associated with a range of cardiovascular diseases. And the question is, what about children? And we've been working on the hypothesis that sleep disorder breathing in children may be associated with earlier vascular aging and in turn cardiovascular disease later in life. I might mention that the volume of research in this area is fairly limited, so there's not much to draw on, and much of what I'm presenting is fairly novel. So given that we think there's association between SDB and earlier vascular aging, we've undertaken a series of studies, first of all looking at functional changes to the cardiovascular system, and secondly looking at structural changes to blood vessels. And in the first case with functional changes, mostly we've been undertaking studies that have been looking at what the consequences may be on the vessel itself, and we hypothesize that evidence of early vascular aging is a stiffer vessel, which can be, I guess, evidenced by that vessel having an increasing blood flow. And in terms of structural changes, over and above actually looking at the arteries and themselves, we have become interested in the role that sympathetic innervation may play in the process. So I'll just present a series of studies quickly. In this study, we examined cerebral blood flow velocity, and we compared children with SDB and behavioural insomnia. And I might mention that we're not the first to actually look at blood flow in children with SDB. A few other groups have done that. But what we did find was that indeed there was a difference between controls and children with insomnia and SDB. In fact, pretty well all the indicators of flow were higher in children with SDB, indicating that the vessels probably are stiffer. Let me turn to another article that we've published, and again, looking at another part of the cardiovascular system. We looked at the brachial artery, and again, the hypothesis here is that if the blood flow velocity is increased, that's evidence of a stiffer vessel, which supports the argument for earlier vascular aging. We've actually used a modified flow-mediated dilatation protocol. We've actually extended the measurement time out until a couple of minutes. And I'll just show you this slide here. And again, what we have found is that both the time to maximal dilatation and the time to return back to baseline is diminished in children with sleep disorder breathing. And in addition, the velocity time integral is faster in children with SDB. All these things indicate that you've got a stiffer tube or stiffer vessel. Finally, we've also done some studies looking at the aorta and blood flow velocity there. Here, what we've done is we've looked at a cross-section of the aorta using MRI, looked at the cross-sectional area at end diastole and end systole, and knowing the time between those two things and the difference in the surface area, then you can calculate the velocity. And as with the other two, we find again that blood flow velocity is greater in children with SDB, indicating that the vessels are probably stiffer and further evidencing earlier vascular aging. So the things that I've shown you, I guess, are showing across most of the arterial systems, we see that the vessels are stiffer, which is indicative of early aging. And the broader question is, what are the consequences of that? In addition, we've also turned our eye looking at platelet aggregation. And the reason for that is that stiffer vessels result in higher velocity and friction, leading to endothelial damage, and hence you'd expect there to be greater platelet aggregation in that situation. And lo and behold, depending how you measure platelet aggregation, what technique, but pretty well, we have found that platelet aggregation levels are elevated in children with STB, further evidencing that there's functional effects on the cardiovascular system. So we are also looking at inflammatory markers. And again, we do find that there are differences, but I won't talk too much on that because it's a devilish area to unpack, but it's one of further interest. So I've talked about functional changes. What about structural changes? Let me just say that the primary treatment for sleep disorder breathing in children is adenotonsillectomy. And a genius of an idea that came from Anna was, why don't we actually harvest the tonsil tissue after surgery and examine for structural changes? And so really a credit to Anna for that insightful suggestion. So rather than going in the rubbish bin, we've actually pulled it out of the bin and started to look at the tissue. And in this study, we were interested in what is the effect of STB on sympathetic nerve fiber innervation. And the assumption here is that sleep disorder breathing is associated with sympathetic overactivation, which leads to chronic hyperstimulation of the blood vessel and in turn stiffer vessels. So do we see that there's a change in sympathetic innervation of children with STB? So clearly we can't get data from children that haven't had their tonsils, who haven't got STB because they don't need their tonsils out. But what we can do is compare children who have a higher velocity, whereas compared to those with a lower velocity in their blood flow. And we determined that using the brachial artery method as described earlier, and stained the sympathetic nerves. And what we did then was count, I guess, the volume of sympathetic innervation in a certain area. And lo and behold, what we did find was that the greater your velocity time index, which is an indicator of a stiffer vessel, which is an indicator, hopefully, of earlier vascular aging, that indeed these children had a greater amount of sympathetic innervation, and which was also correlated with other measures of sympathetic hyperarousal, such as those that are associated with the pupillary light reflex, and incidentally was also associated quite strongly with platelet aggregation. So where to from here? Well, we are at the moment looking at the blood vessels directly to see if there are changes to the medial thickness or the adventia. We've also got the opportunity, because we've been working with people at Flinders, to look at tissue from adults with STB who've had a surgical procedure to rearrange their jaw and their airway, called a UPPP. So that's a snapshot of the work that we've been doing, and hopefully presenting, I guess, some evidence that indeed sleep disorder breathing is associated with cardiovascular deficits in children, and that perhaps these children do have earlier vascular aging because their system seems to be not as flexible as you would expect in children without the disorder. The longer term goal would be to see in these children, if we did a follow-up in 20 years, are these the sorts of children that grow up to be adults with hypertension and other cardiovascular problems. Thank you for your attention, and over to Susan.
Oh, got a lovely shot there. Thank you very much, Kurt. That's just raised a whole lot more questions in my mind as well. I'll just open the Q&A if anybody wants to post a question there for you. Otherwise, as Siobhan said earlier on, I know both of you are very approachable and would really welcome people to get in touch if you have any questions about your research. So, Kurt, you haven't got any information now yet about the children who've had their adenoids removed and whether their vascular elasticity returns? Or
that's a very good question. Indeed, we are hoping to look at pre and post adenotonsillectomy. We probably should have done that right at the start, but we didn't. We have had several attempts at getting some grant funding, but yes, no, we do want to see whether the vasculature is, well, at least any declines are stopped by surgery and whether things improve or not.
Because we just had a quick look at people's sleep after stroke in the rehab units, and yeah, indeed their sleep is disordered after stroke. But I mean, we were writing it up as a post-stroke phenomenon, but maybe it's not a result of, but maybe it's a different kind of a relationship. They're bad sleepers anyway.
Indeed, yeah, you might have two. Yeah, it might be A and B.
Yeah, we were looking at it particularly around its relationship to physical activity and whether if we kept people more active, were they going to sleep better? We didn't have enough numbers to show that, but certainly the sleep was poor enough for us to realise that rehab, and we need to, is it the rehab centre that's hard place to sleep in, which is something that you guys could sort out, or is it the stroke? They can't move, get comfortable. Maybe their breathing is disordered because of facial palsies or all sorts of things, but there is just so much that we don't know about sleep and breathing in different populations.
Yep.
So that's fantastic. Everybody's been very shy about questions, and that's typical. So hopefully they'll all get in touch with you. So it just remains me to thank you both very, very much for fabulous presentations. You've completely met all my expectations for being terrific. And showcasing the great research that you're doing with industry in collaboration with partners. So thanks audience.